The thick morning mist of the European theater, whether hanging over the jagged hedgerows of Normandy or the frozen pines of the Ardennes, constantly frustrated the rigid geometric calculations of the German military mind. For the aristocratic officers of the Wehrmacht and the battle-hardened commanders of the Panzer Divisions, war was a bloody but fundamentally logical exercise rooted in centuries of Prussian military tradition. They were trained to read the battlefield like a chessboard, where the movements of the enemy could be predicted based on established doctrines, logistical limitations, and the visible massing of forces. When executing their own reconnaissance operations known as Aufklärung, the Germans utilized heavily armed armored cars and mechanized infantry designed to aggressively fight for information. They expected the enemy to do the same. They anticipated a localized vanguard clash, a probing attack that would reveal the main axis of advance, allowing the German defenders to adjust their lines and prepare the killing blows. But as the American army pushed deeper into the European continent, the German intelligence apparatus found itself entirely blindfolded by a tactical phenomenon it simply could not comprehend. German commanders continually reported back to their headquarters in a state of deep professional bewilderment, stating that the United States Army reconnaissance units were not just difficult to track but mathematically and doctrinally impossible to predict. To understand this profound tactical disconnect, one must examine the fundamental differences in how the two nations approach the concept of battlefield observation. The German Panzeraufklärungsabteilung, or Armored Reconnaissance Battalion, was a formidable heavy instrument of war. Equipped with complex heavily armored vehicles like the 8-wheeled Schwerer Panzerspauwagen, these units were designed to smash into the enemy picket lines, force the enemy to deploy their anti-tank weapons, and measure the enemy strength by the volume of fire they received. It was a philosophy of loud, destructive reconnaissance. The German commander believed that you could only know the enemy by fighting him. The United States military, driven by the pragmatic cavalry traditions of the Western frontier and the industrial realities of mass automotive production, adopted a completely opposite philosophy. American doctrine, specifically outlined in the field manuals of the mechanized cavalry squadrons, dictated a policy of sneak and peek. The primary mission of an American reconnaissance unit was not to engage in combat but to observe, report, and survive. This required a completely different type of machine and a completely different type of soldier. The physical manifestation of this American doctrine was the Willys MB Jeep and the M8 Greyhound light armored car. To the German commanders observing these vehicles through their binocular optics, they appeared suicidally fragile. The Jeep possessed no armor plating whatsoever, offering its crew absolutely no protection from even the smallest caliber rifle fire. The M8 Greyhound, despite possessing a 37mm main gun, was only lightly armored and completely open-topped, making it highly vulnerable to artillery airbursts and infantry ambushes. The German military mind, which prized heavy armor and high-velocity weaponry, could not fathom why an army would send its scouts forward in such unprotected machines. But what the Germans perceived as a fatal weakness was actually the core of the American tactical advantage. The Jeep and the Greyhound possessed a mechanical footprint that allowed them to completely bypass the traditional avenues of approach. The Willys Jeep was a masterpiece of lightweight automotive engineering. Weighing just over 2,000 pounds and powered by a highly reliable 4-cylinder Go Devil engine, it possessed a 4-wheel drive system that allowed it to traverse terrain that would instantly bog down a heavy German armored car. American cavalrymen realized very quickly that if they drove down the main paved roads, they would be slaughtered by pre-sighted German anti-tank guns. Therefore, they simply abandoned the roads. American reconnaissance squads drove their jeeps through dense forests, across shallow muddy rivers, and up steep rocky ravines that the German topographic maps had explicitly marked as impassable to motor vehicles. A German battalion commander defending a strategic crossroads would meticulously position his heavy weapons to cover the main highway, fully expecting the American vanguard to arrive exactly where the map dictated they must. Instead, the American reconnaissance patrols would materialize miles away, filtering silently through the dense woods and observing the German flanks from unmapped elevations. This hypermobility completely shattered the linear geometry of the German defense. The Germans could not predict the American movements because the Americans were ignoring the very concept of a defined front line. Furthermore, the American cavalrymen operated with a decentralized tactical fluidity that defied German institutional logic. A German reconnaissance probe was highly structured, moving in specific formations under the direct control of a commissioned officer who adhered strictly to the orders issued by his regimental commander. The American Reconnaissance Troop, by contrast, was a highly elastic organism composed of small autonomous platoons and squads often led by junior sergeants or even corporals. These young men, heavily influenced by the American cultural emphasis on mechanical problem-solving and individual initiative, were given a simple strategic objective such as finding a bridge over a specific river and then explicitly trusted to figure out the methodology on their own. If an American Jeep patrol encountered a heavily fortified German roadblock, they did not request permission to attack it, nor did they attempt a costly frontal assault to test its strength. They simply reversed their vehicles, disappeared back into the forest, and spent the next several hours probing miles of adjacent terrain until they found a gap in the German lines. They flowed around the heavy German strongpoints like water flowing around a rock, finding the path of least resistance. This behavior utterly confused the German defenders. The German outposts would report hearing the high-pitched whine of American vehicle engines in the distance, but the expected attack never materialized. The American scouts would observe the German positions from a concealed vantage point, taking meticulous notes on the location of machine gun nests, the caliber of the anti-tank guns, and the movement of supply trucks. They did this without firing a single shot, prioritizing stealth and observation over engagement. The German commanders, waiting for the traditional clash of vanguards, found themselves fighting shadows. They knew the Americans were out there because they could occasionally hear them or catch a fleeting glimpse of a low-profile vehicle moving through the distant brush, but they could never fix the American positions or force them into a decisive engagement. The American reconnaissance forces were entirely detached from the heavy, predictable logistical tether that bound the main infantry and armored divisions, allowing them to operate deep within the gray zones of the battlefield. But the true terrifying lethality of the American reconnaissance units lay not in their mobility but in the invisible weapon they carried bolted into the back of their fragile vehicles. The United States military was the most radio-dense combat force in the history of warfare. While the German army struggled with chronic shortages of copper wire and fragile vacuum tubes, the American industrial base produced hundreds of thousands of highly reliable frequency-modulated radio sets. Every single American reconnaissance vehicle, from the open-topped M8 Greyhound to the smallest quarter-ton Jeep, was equipped with sophisticated communication equipment such as the SCR-284 or the SCR-508 radio sets. This technological omnipresence fundamentally altered the purpose of the forward scout. The American cavalryman did not need heavy armor or a large-caliber tank gun because his primary weapon was the radio handset. When an American reconnaissance patrol silently navigated a forest trail and discovered a hidden assembly area of German Panzer IV tanks, they did not engage them with their nominal vehicle weapons. Instead, the scout would calmly unspool a long whip antenna, pick up the radio microphone, and transmit a precise grid coordinate back to the divisional artillery networks resting safely miles behind the front lines. The German tank commanders, sitting idle in their supposedly secure camouflage netting, would suddenly hear the terrifying supersonic shriek of incoming heavy artillery. Within moments, their hidden assembly area would be obliterated by a massive concentration of 155mm high-explosive shells equipped with deadly proximity fuses. The American reconnaissance units were essentially forward air controllers and artillery spotters mounted on high-speed off-road vehicles. The German intelligence officers attempting to analyze this behavior were completely paralyzed. They could not understand how the Americans were delivering such devastatingly accurate artillery strikes without having launched a formal attack to secure the necessary observation posts. They could not predict the American artillery fire because they could not predict the movement of the invisible, highly mobile radio operators who were calling it in. This integration of lightweight, highly mobile vehicles and advanced radio communications created a reconnaissance network that was infinitely flexible and completely non-linear. The German commanders, who were trained to anticipate massive localized buildups of force before an offensive, found their entire operational depth compromised by tiny, isolated groups of men driving jeeps who refused to fight but reported everything they saw. A German panzer division attempting a secret nighttime redeployment would find its columns illuminated by artillery flares and subsequently bombarded, not because they had been intercepted by an American armored column but because a single American sergeant hiding in a ditch with a radio had heard the squeak of their tank tracks in the dark. The unpredictability stemmed from the sheer volume and the decentralized nature of these patrols. There was no main effort for the Germans to identify and crush. The American reconnaissance screen was a vast porous membrane covering the entire front, constantly shifting and observing, never offering a solid target for the heavy German counterattacks. The psychological toll this inflicted on the German officer corps was profound. The fundamental basis of command is the illusion of control, the belief that by analyzing the map and understanding the enemy doctrine, a commander can impose order on the chaos of battle. The American reconnaissance units stripped this illusion away entirely. A German general could never be certain that his flanks were secure because he knew that somewhere out in the freezing rain or the dense fog American scouts were likely bypassing his carefully laid minefields and observing his rear echelon supply routes. He could not predict where the American main attack would fall because the American reconnaissance screen did not point like an arrow toward the objective. Instead, it blanketed the entire region, feeding thousands of data points back to the American High Command. The traditional indicators of an impending attack, such as aggressive probing actions or the localized massing of armored cars, simply did not exist in the American tactical playbook. This ground-based unpredictability was massively amplified by the American integration of light aviation, a technological asset that the German commanders learned to fear above almost all others. The United States Army deployed thousands of Piper J-3 Cubs, militarily designated as the L-4 Grasshopper. These tiny fabric-covered monoplanes were entirely unarmored, and possessed a top speed of barely 80 miles per hour. To the pilots of the Luftwaffe flying heavily armed Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, the Grasshopper looked like a fragile toy. But to the German ground forces, the appearance of an L-4 Grasshopper slowly circling above the battlefield was a harbinger of absolute destruction. The Grasshopper operated as an airborne extension of the ground reconnaissance network. It could take off from a dirt road or a muddy field directly behind the front lines, fly at incredibly low altitudes to avoid German radar, and provide the American artillery battalions with an uninterrupted panoramic view of the battlefield. The German commanders found the aerial reconnaissance impossible to predict or counter because of the sheer abundance of these aircraft and the total Allied supremacy of the skies. If a German anti-aircraft battery revealed its position by firing on a Grasshopper, the slow-flying pilot would simply transmit the coordinates and the battery would be instantly erased by counter-battery artillery fire. Consequently, German armored columns and infantry battalions were ordered to cease all movement and maintain absolute camouflage discipline the moment a Grasshopper appeared in the sky. An entire panzer regiment capable of punching through a heavily fortified defensive line could be completely paralyzed for hours by a single unarmed canvas airplane circling lazily in the clouds. The German commanders realized with bitter frustration that their movements were no longer dictated by their own operational timetables but by the unpredictable random presence of American scouts both on the ground and in the air. They were fighting an enemy that had decoupled observation from combat, relying on speed, stealth, and an overwhelming industrial capacity to manufacture radios and light vehicles. The inability of the German military to predict American reconnaissance was not a failure of intelligence but a failure of imagination. They were projecting their own rigid, highly structured martial philosophy onto an enemy that viewed warfare as a massive fluid engineering problem. The Germans could not explain how a force of unarmored jeeps could effectively screen an entire armored division because they could not accept that combat was no longer the primary means of gathering intelligence. They could not anticipate the routes of the American patrols because they assumed the Americans would obey the same geographic restrictions that governed their own heavy vehicles. They searched for the grand strategic logic in the movements of the American cavalry and failed to realize that the logic was entirely decentralized, resting in the localized pragmatic decisions of thousands of junior enlisted men operating with an unprecedented level of autonomy and technological support. The American reconnaissance network was a chaotic, swarming organism of observation that refused to engage on German terms, rendering the vast tactical experience of the Wehrmacht entirely useless in the face of an enemy they could not find, could not fight, and could never predict.